Back to our heritage range of interviews, and today I'm joined by Peter Posner from the UK, and he's going to share an hour or just over an hour with us talking about some of his experiences, some of his fantastic memories, and some of the fantastic work that he's been involved in during his time at the European Alliance in different roles. And before we jump to that, if you've just clicked on this and you don't know where you are, you can hit pause and go and grab yourself a tea and a coffee, and then come back and spend the rest of the time with me and Peter as we kind of unpack this. So welcome back to this heritage range, or welcome for the first time. Down below in the description, there'll be more links where you can go and find other interviews with staff members or people from YMCA Heritage History. But today it's all about Peter. So Peter, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for asking me.
It's a pleasure, really. So, Peter, would you like obviously everybody knows your name, but would you like to just kind of introduce yourself, a little bit about you, your interests, family, anything you're willing to share with us?
Sure, of course. Peter Posner. I live in the middle of England, 200 kilometers north of London, in a hilly area where people come for their holidays because it's attractive. I used to work when I was working for a major bank, and the reason that we live where we do is because I got a move here, and this is the last move that I had in my career, and we love it here. It means that my joy of walking and cycling is easy to cover because of where we live. Married. In fact, in a week or so, it'll be 45 years we've been married, and we've got two daughters. One lives fairly locally, one lives other part of the country, and two grandchildren who, again, luckily live locally, so we see them quite often. Retired a few years ago from working in the bank, but have been and continue to be a volunteer with the YMCA.
Wonderful. And Peter, maybe that could lead us on to, as you said, you're a volunteer in the YMCA, and as we know, those are the most precious gifts that the YMCA has. How did you get involved in the YMCA right at the beginning, before we get to the presidency and YMCA Europe and World YMCA stuff? What was your first impressions? How did you get involved?
Well, I mentioned I work in a bank, and it was my first managerial job in a large office of the bank in the middle of England, a city called Leicester. And traditionally, the senior manager of that office was the treasurer of the local YMCA, which was a few hundred meters up the road. And he got one of the junior managers, me, it was at that time, to volunteer to become the assistant treasurer of the YMCA. And I thought, okay, do that. In those days, it was helping with the banking and writing out checks and stuff. I was 27 at the time, and you can imagine not a lot has changed. I was easily half the age of anybody else on the board when I started on that board. There were one or two women, I think, certainly one, might have been two, but the rest of them were the good old grey-haired gentlemen of the city. What did I think of it? I thought, well, to begin with, the job wasn't too onerous, and I quite enjoyed it. But then it was a 2-year role before I moved jobs and moved away. And I did something strange at the end of that 2 years. I said to the board, what's the chance of me staying on to be a board member? And they had to have a board meeting to see if that was okay, but it was all right. And a few years later after that, I was chair of that YMCA, and off we went. That was my career within career. That was my role within the YMCA established. Yeah.
And of course, you're still involved in your local YMCA even today, I believe.
Yeah, I am. I was chair of that up until recently, and now I help out. I've been there so long. It's for governance reasons. They're glad to see that. No, they're not. Let's pause that one. I've been involved in my local YMCA for 20 odd years, and I moved on, and there's been a couple of new chair people take over, and it's brilliant. But yes, I am actively involved with it. I help fundraise, I help involve stuff, I mentor people there.
So, Peter, obviously, we're going to be talking a little bit about your presidency today, but how did you start to get involved with the European Y and the international element? You've spoken to us about how, at a local level, you kind of joined in and got elected and carried on and helped in the governance. How does that bridge up to an international level?
Well, um, I suppose one of the challenges that I had was difficult to say no. So when the YMCA threw all these lovely opportunities at me, I grasped them. I loved it. And I started in 1981 and became chair of that local YMCA a few years later, say mid-80s, whenever it was, and got involved nationally because I was chair of the YMCA. And then because I was, again, let's say early 30s, still relatively young, this is before youth empowerment was even dreamt of, somebody must have seen something in me and invited me to take part as an English representative at a training course in Ernst Willem in Holland, in Netherlands, at a YMCA, European Alliance of YMCA's training course for senior volunteers, something like that. And it was a week's course, and we learned governance, we learned finance, we learned the structure of the European Alliance of YMCA's, and made friends. And one of the strange things was it was really exotic because there were people there from Central and Eastern Europe that most of us had never met before, which was incredible. And they must have seen something in me there. And 2 years after that, 1991, I was elected to the World Alliance Executive Committee.
Wow.
As the English representative on the World Alliance Executive until 94, which most of the time was held in Switzerland, in Geneva. And that opened up my eyes to this world organization that we're in, and the structure. And goodness, they've got a YMCA in, I don't know what, Singapore or Australia or South America. Absolutely amazing. Not only just one down the road that I was used to. Yeah.
So you're painting a wonderful picture here of just kind of getting involved and then, doing stuff locally, then European, then world, and doors just opening and you just grabbing those opportunities. I guess there came a certain point where you either had a conversation or had the interest to go for the presidency of the European Alliance, or the AEY. It's been called so many different things. Talk us through that. Was that something that somebody approached you, or you had kind of felt was a natural progression, or how did that work for you?
No, it wasn't a natural progression because it was this is little old me we're talking about. But it wasn't quite straight into the presidency. I said that I finished the World Alliance in 1994. Shortly after that, the then General Secretary of the European Alliance of YMCA is our good friend Dolph Vader, who then and still lives in St. Gallen in Switzerland. He did something really exotic, which was incredible. He got on a plane from Switzerland that flew all the way to Birmingham in the UK, where I was working at the time in my banking job. And he came to see me for a few hours. I thought that was astonishing, to convince me that I really ought to become the next European Alliance treasurer.
Wow.
And with my banking background, it was obviously a natural place for me to get involved with. And so I think I gave it about 1.5 seconds of consideration before, yeah, blimey, okay, I'll have a go at that. And I stood for election in 1996 as treasurer and was elected treasurer. And in fact, I had 2 terms of treasurer alongside Jan Nisteen, the then president. So I did from 1996 to 2004, 8 years of European treasurer. And the Secretary General at the time was Johan Wilhelm Eltvik, and he was great insofar as he also invested in us. And if I was able, as a treasurer, not as president, to go to 1 or 2 international meetings with him. So I remember going to one of the big American YMCA conferences, for example. And so I got a really good grounding in not only the European YMCA, but also the global YMCA. Yeah.
So, and then of course, after that was time for you to be president, I guess. And I see that you're a really humble guy, and that's great. And I think, it's great to know you and to know what you give to the YMCA. But talk us through that. Talk us through about being elected as president and kind of that process.
Well, I was encouraged to stand as president, having been on the European executive for 8 years, obviously as treasurer. So I knew what was happening and I knew what was going on around the movement. And one thing that I do remember, which is I think very interesting, is before my time, in particular, before Glasnost, Perestroika, the fall of the wall, all of that time moment, I seem to remember there were 18 YMCA movements in Europe, and they principally were in the West and the North. And even in my day, the YMCAs in the south of Europe were relatively new. Spain, for example, Malta was relatively new. And there was a grouping for the southern YMCAs, including France as well and Italy, to support themselves because they needed their own support because they weren't as established as some others. Anyway, it went during my time, and obviously not everything to do with me, but it went from 18 national movements. So I think we were working in 44 movements by the time we'd finished. It was such a wonderful time where all the established YMCAs were desperately eager and encouraging to open up YMCAs in the former Central and Eastern Europe. It was astonishing. Resources, people, ideas, it was great. And that, I think, was one of the major features of the time that I was president. We were just opening up and developing new YMCAs. Not straightforward. There were things called field groups. I don't know if they still exist, but it was determined. Before my day, there was $1 million awarded to us from USAID, which paid for, when Dolph Vader was still Secretary General, paid for 2 or 3 members of staff to work in those new opening YMCAs. Countries, and some of those countries would have had YMCAs in them prior to the Second World War. And I'll give an example of Russia. I mean, Russia is 100 and something years old, its YMCA, but it closed down all the time from the Second World War until whenever it was, until the Glasnost times. And so we were establishing brand new YMCAs and reopening after a break point of 40 odd years, other YMCAs. Incredible. And what's amazing is we'd established YMCA. I can remember stories when we went into the Czech Republic, people who had been YMCA people 40, 50 years before came forward to help, to introduce people, to say, these buildings used to belong to the YMCA, you ought to get them back again. And remarkable. Yeah. So very exciting time.
It sounds it. And I guess, you were just talking about how some of your other commitments had seen you go to Geneva, and that I guess that opened up for you a lot more possibilities to go on different visits and different and have the executives anywhere. Is there any fun memories or certain moments you have from kind of going across to a new country or a new area? Is there anything you can recall that stands out as a fun memory for you?
Well, if you allow me to also include the 4 years that I was president of the World YMCA, then I was 4 years as the immediate past president of the World YMCA. I reckon I've been to something like 55 countries where YMCAs exist. And I've been in 5-star hotels where I've been put, and I've been sleeping in tents or literally in tents or in hostel dormitories or something. I mean, it doesn't matter to me where I sleep as long as it's safe. But the key thing is just how, wherever you go, there was somebody waiting to meet you at the airport, say, or at the train station. Wonderful YMCA people who you meet, even though you'd never met them before, and you might be, I don't know what, umpteen hours traveling from home. You just knew you were safe, and you knew that you were going to be looked after, and you knew that you could influence in a delicate and a sensitive way the direction of travel for that YMCA. Because even then we were talking about having a unified strategy, which has now become global policy. Because the old question of, okay, we've all heard of the YMCA, but it's usually at a disco. What's a YMCA? And you know, that's been the same all the time. And so we were trying to unify stuff, and that's another story which we'll probably pick up to do with youth empowerment, for example.
Well, let's just switch across to there. And it seems you've visited everywhere and gone around and done so many different roles. But I think one of the main things that stands out from your time in the seat as president would be this kind of youth empowerment. And I include YES network in terms of the European content. Those were the things that started to, they've always been there in the background, but really probably pick up steam and traction and become more of a priority, I guess, at the international level. So would you like to share a little bit about youth empowerment or YES in general?
Yeah, of course. And it's such a big topic, but just going back in time, and this is what everybody knows, the YMCA is a federation, which means that wherever the YMCA is established, not only within a country, but individual countries, they are their own organization in their own legal rights. They're not part of one big team that's managed from Geneva. And so one of the strengths of the YMCA is that each local YMCA serves its local community, and whatever that might be. So yours, Adi, is different from mine. Well, they're both brilliant YMCAs, but that we do different things, and quite correctly. The downside of that is, what's the statistic now? There's something like 14,000 YMCAs in the world, probably doing 14,000 different things, which is great, but it's also, well, what is the YMCA? And the one thing that we have in common pretty much everywhere is working with young people and trying to develop young people to the best of their abilities. And so working alongside, I've mentioned him, Johan Wilhelm Eltvik, it was thought, okay, what is it we all do? We all work with young people. We do it differently, but we all work with young people. And one way of encapsulating that idea, and it was discussed in typical YMCA, there were committees and subcommittees, and it went around and iterations, and went back again and came back again. And we ended up with the phrase of youth empowerment. And one of the challenges, does it translate into different languages very comfortably? Well, it didn't always, but most of the time it did. And what does empowerment mean in different worlds and so on? But nevertheless, it was agreed that that's what we were going to do. And so within Europe, we introduced this concept of why don't we all work alongside the strategic direction of youth empowerment. To back that up, we did some research with, if my memory tells me, 2010, something like 18,000 young people in, I can't remember how many countries all over the place, which gave an academically, statistically viable way of saying we're actually speaking for 1 million people here, the way that these polls go. And there was a book, a report published called 1 Million Voices, and it has said actually within youth empowerment we need to be thinking about young people. What are young people thinking about? They're thinking about how to get a job, how can they be skilled to get a job, what's their place in society, civic engagement, what are their rights, what are their roles in life. They're really passionate about the environment, so we need to talk about the environment, and so on. There were 4 areas which came out of that. That was great, but we needed more money. So nothing's changed. We always needed more money. So we thought we'd alongside all of this, we thought we'd see if we can get some sponsorship. And we employed somebody at the time who was a fundraiser and used contacts, and we went into places to say, can we have some money, please? Because of all these kids all over Europe, we want to develop them. We can use your name alongside of the work we do, which would be fantastic, wouldn't it? Obviously, we were very careful who we went to, so we didn't want to be associated with people we didn't indeed want to be associated with. And the story came back. I can remember, without naming names, one chief executive of a huge, great big European company that we were lucky to get in to see, say, yeah, I like your story, but don't know you. And I've got this big pile of applications here from other people. And I know them and I can work with them and they can deliver. So thanks, but no thanks. So that was a bit of a tip towards, not only do we need a unified strategy, so we can say, look at all this youth empowerment work we're doing around Europe and these are the outputs. But it also came one of the outputs of that was thinking about changing our logo. And that's where we went from the European Alliance of YMCAs, EAY, to YMCA Europe. And it's a logo that many people in Europe will know and have copied. And I think it's fantastic with the modern writing, the little triangle bit. And so a further extension of that was countries around, some countries, not everybody, some countries around Europe said we need to focus more on engaging young people, because I mentioned at the outset, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but actually factually, you look at the committees and the governance structures, and it was older people. How on earth do we get young people? We're a youth organisation, but where are the young people? And so a number of people, a number of countries said, okay, let's do something. It's not going to happen organically, because by then we were 150 odd years old, whatever.
Yeah.
We need to do something. And that's where Yes came into it, where like everything in life, there were certain key people around Europe. I can think, Adi, you and I both know a chap in England who spearheaded that, and started picking out young people with potential in the same way that I was picked out all those years before, and investing in them for times, giving them opportunities to visit places, training, similar to the things that I had all those years before. And there's this cohort of engaged young people. I'm speaking to one of them now, who we suddenly thought, okay, look at all these young people that can do stuff. Why don't we let them do things? They're so keen to do it. So that's where Yes came from, and it was very strong in Europe. And passionate young people led a passionate young organisation, and they had to be doubly strong, because not so passionate older people were thinking, what are they doing, making all this noise? But goodness, those people that we invested in are now part of the leadership. I mean, it's self-evident that it was worthwhile. And
yeah, and I would say, Peter, that you're absolutely right. It proved a door or an opening or an opportunity for so many people to come to the party and be part of it, and whether that's a working group or just as a participant or going off into governance. And I certainly think, as I look at your presidencies, having the change agents globally, but also the Yes stuff at the European level, there is now, I'm comfortable to say, if you're watching this in these years, in the 2000s, this is great. But there's a whole generation of young leaders who are in their YMCAs because of these kind of initiatives. So I would completely agree with you, Peter, on that. And I think you've also tapped on kind of the change in terms of the logo, and that was going to be one of my questions. But I guess parallel to this, what you're saying, tell me a little bit about the Prague festivals, because there's one thing having those kind of conversations and providing those opportunities, but I guess under you and in your time in both the European Alliance, World Alliance, these festivals really walk the walk in terms of giving those spaces.
I mentioned Dov Bader, who was in charge of YMCA Europe when I first came along, and he lived in St. Gallen in Switzerland, and his office was in St. Gallen in Switzerland. And when he retired and Johan Wilhelm took over, there was a bit of an assumption that, well, he lived in Oslo, so the office will go to Oslo. But he took a brave decision, we took a brave decision to say, well, actually, we need an office that's accessible from east, west, north, and south. And we brought the office and opened an office in Prague, which, if you look at the map, is in the middle. It was easily accessible from all over the place because it was such a draw for tourism, which means that there were lots of cheap flights, which means we could get there relatively easily.
Very smart.
And so we gave YMCA Europe a home within Prague, which was great, and we had some fantastic staff there that ran it, and they had to, because not everybody, most people worked from home. There was this very small office in Prague, and people all over Europe, and they kept the machine working well and smoothly. So having established a home in Prague, the next thing to do is to say, okay, what can we do to bring people not only to Prague, but actually bring people together in this newly expanded east, west, north, south Europe? And not only that, maybe other people would be interested within the family. So we came up with the idea of having a festival in Prague. What's the festival mean? Well, it was going to be lots of music, because Tensing was massive. It still is a big thing, but it was massive in Europe then, all over Europe. We had lots of governance training. We had lots of strategy training to deliver. We had lots of fun to have together, just to be able for people to meet. So, long story short, lots and lots of planning. In 2008, we took over a park in central Prague, and we had about 5,000 people from all over the place, mainly Europe, but I remember 400 or 500 or 600 from the USA, from South America, from Asia, from Africa. Gosh, and we had this brilliant event which took place in circus teepees, these big marquees that you see circuses going on, coupled with the fact that it was about 30 degrees plus centigrade all the time. So not only were we inside a tent, but it was hot anyway. So daft things like that the fire brigade would come and spray the crowd with water, which was great, and everybody loved it. We had great cooperation from the city. So the accommodation we used was university halls of residence, which might have been, some of them, bless them, were about an hour's travel by tram out of the centre. Everybody had an armband on their wrists, and they could show it to the driver, and off they went along on these journeys, and it was wonderful, and it put Europe on the map, that we prepared to do something really exciting and absolutely totally youth focused. So great festival.
Excellent. And of course, there was 3 festivals in the end, all very different. And in the end, maybe I don't know, 15,000 participants over 3 festivals. I think as you are kind of weaving this story for us today, to see that all these things are parallel, the youth empowerment and the festivals, and the spaces for young people, and identifying young leaders, and that, I think it's wonderful to hear. Another thing, Peter, when I looked at kind of the time that you were president in Europe, and I guess we could touch on it slightly, was YMCA not only giving these space for young people, but also kind of an attempt to try and do some peace work, or trying to step into maybe conflict or war kind of post countries that were having issues either in the past or that. And I know during your presidency, some, the Roots for Reconciliation was established, and I guess the opening up, the expansion that you've touched on. How important was it, or can you share anything around that peace work approach of the YMCA? And of course yourself being involved in that.
The Europe if you look at a map of the world, Europe is this bit in this great big place, but there are, as I said, 40 odd countries where we were working in, which covered all sorts of demographic, however you want to measure the demographic, whether it be by racial background or by economics or by gender or whatever, everything was in there. And I remember, just jumping slightly ahead, but I remember talking about the piecework that we had recently been started, and they'd been to the former Yugoslavia states, which is now half a dozen or more different countries. And I remember them talking about being at a training event with young people from that part of the world, and they could literally smell the smoke from the fires from the conflict. I'm getting quite emotional about it. And this is the reality that we were dealing with within Europe. It wasn't a matter of who had the best swimming pool or the football court. Yeah. It was people's lives were being affected in a major way. And we still then had refugees coming from the further eastern countries where they were economically more challenged than they would have been in the West. And so one of the fabulous things that we did was to say, look, there has been conflict and there's potential for conflict. Rather than try and smile at it and pour oil over it, let's actually do something. And one of the brilliant things, and it still happens, is actually bringing young people together from these conflict zones or former conflict zones that might have been enemies. Let's not beat about the bush. There might have been enemies in the past, but these are YMCA people. They're young people. I mean, at the end of the day, they're young people. And so they were brought together under the roots of reconciliation. And our good friend Vardan Humbard-Zoumian has led it for all these years and has had life-changing effect on not only the participants of those meetings and the trainings, but also people around it see that it's happening and has happened. And that's one thing that we can do. We're apolitical. We're happy to talk to whoever's there. We just come along and we'll give you a hug, sort of thing. And let's work together and let's build up relationships. And that's one of the most significant, I think I'd be right in saying, one of the most significant effects we have on communities of conflict around the world. Yeah. Now that I'm no longer the world president and no longer the immediate past president, I can shout out that I think YMCA Europe has had massive effects on what happens around the world. I was the president, as president of YMCA Europe, I sat on the executive of the World Alliance, and all presidents do. It's one of the things they do, and we are influential on that. We have good reputations to take a sensible line and actually get work done. We've talked about youth empowerment, that started in Europe. We talked about logos, that started in Europe. We talked about, I've mentioned briefly, the Vision 2030, which the World Alliance has put through to the world movement at the World Council a year ago, and the whole movement has bought into that. If you actually analyze that, it's back to what we used to do in Europe sort of 10 years ago, 15 years ago, which is brilliant. And isn't it great that we can learn from all the good things and also learn from bad stuff and get rid of it? But the roots it goes along quietly in its own way and gets involved with people and has massively impactful outcomes in dealing with very difficult issues. And Adi, you're sitting in a country that's part of that, you know?
That is correct. That is correct. And yeah, and I think it's what you said. I think quite often in the YMCA we don't blow our own horn or bang our own drum, whichever words you want to say. And I think you shared earlier that, you know, a huge company CEO didn't know who we are. mainly because we're so busy doing the work half of the time that sometimes we forget to bang that drum. And as you said, some of the best work and some of the most impactful work originated or sparked from Europe. And I think, as we all know, and we're celebrating YMCA European heritage, Europe is ever changing and will continue to change. And Peter, thank you for sharing some of that. Those different kind of, I guess, the projects or the work or the people over your presidency. And let's just switch, because it's not always about the festivals and those things. Let's talk a little bit. I'm sure as president you had some kind of duties to kind of open stuff or make decisions or hiring and firing. Let's just switch pace a little bit. I know YMCA Europe had a training center in Little Mishel that had been built up over many years with lots of support, a fantastic fundraising effort. And I guess in your presidency, you kind of came in as that was kind of, a lot of that work had been done, but you had been involved through different platforms. Do you want to share a little bit about, a training center for the European Y, a place to call home? And maybe, I sent you a picture the other day of you opening, cutting the ribbon of the center. Maybe to share with us a little bit about Little Mishel and kind of the president's role, and you turn up and say a few words and cut the ribbon and all that kind of stuff.
We in the endeavor to not only find a home in Prague, but also find a physical building that we could relate to that would become a YMCA building. I was treasurer when this was being thought through, so I was involved with it to a certain extent. We found this place called Little Mishel, which is 2 hours by train from Prague, southeast from Prague. Never heard of it. Turns out to be a World Heritage Site. Turns out to be one of the most beautiful places in Central Europe you can possibly go to. And this training centre that we've been offered, having got to know the brilliant mayor there, who was so supportive of he was desperate to bring more young people to his city. And one way we could do it is get the YMCA there. Of course you can. So generally speaking, doors were open for us. We had to help them become open, but they were willing. And the building that they were suggesting that we go to was this, I don't know what, 17th century ex-brewery that's literally next door to this World Heritage Site castle, this chateau, which was bonkers. And normally you'd think about going to maybe a school, or you perhaps have some buildings on the outskirts of the town, but it was literally in the heart of the tourist centre of this beautiful town. But it was a bit of a wreck, and so one of the reasons that they wanted us as an international NGO to go in there is because they could use our name correctly to go for fundraising. So they got a load of central government fundraising to develop this. We had to put a substantial stake in there as well, which is typical for property development. If ever had any grant assistance, you've got to show that you're willing to put your money in. The European Alliance of YMCA didn't have money to put into it, so we fundraised, and loads of us put our own money in there. And if you were to go round, you can see that this room was the last 3 presidents' room. Their names are on the doors, and this one is the members of staff that put some money in. And we established this beautiful building, which had hotel-style accommodation. It had hostel-style accommodation. It has some very good training rooms and delivery rooms, and restaurant-type rooms and meeting halls and things. And all of a sudden, we were party to this, and we had to employ staff, which we did. And we were party to this World Heritage Site YMCA training building, which was fantastic. And we had lots of courses there, and we had lots of meetings there. People that weren't used to travel found it challenging to get all the way to Prague, then get across Prague to the station, then take a 2-hour train journey to not even Little Mishel. Then you had to get a bus or be picked up or something to get there. which for me was just good fun, and it worked. But for other people, it was a bit of a psychological block. So it was wonderful. We had some festivals there. We had World Alliance had executives there, several of them, which were very successful. One of the highlights there is I remember going to one of the local restaurants, and one of the members of staff there who comes from Poland, who's still in Poland, he and our Russian member of staff were saying how this old-fashioned pub was very typical of how life was when back in the dark days when they were young. And we ate food there that would have been typical of the time, and people were telling stories of what it was like to grow up in Central and Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain. And it was an astonishing day. And people were there from around the world, just learning what life is like in our part of Europe. And Litter Mitchell was great. And yes, I was asked to literally cut the ribbon. The 3 or 4 of us cut this ribbon, which was good fun. We had a great big key to open the place, which was about 1 meter long, sprayed with silver paint, so it looked like a key, but the paint wouldn't set, so anybody that touched it ended up with silver hands, and all these daft sort of things. But it's great because it's the YMCA, and it was fine. Yeah, nobody was bothered about it. But it literally put us on the map, and we became an influential part of that small city. It's great.
Thanks for sharing that, Peter. And again, as we were saying, buildings and festivals, they're great, but it's the people that are, the stories and the people and the individuals who really are the greatest assets of the YMCA. And it's great to have you today and be talking about this. In terms of, you mentioned earlier kind of working with Johan, and again, at the World Alliance you did that, but there was also, after Johan, Juan Simones came in, and I guess you were there towards the beginning of him coming in. Was the kind of the end of your presidency? You kind of completed your mandate. Is there anything you can tell us around that transition, or kind of was it kind of the end of a chapter, or was it a fresh new book? Europe had also changed, as you said, after the expansion and after the youth empowerment call and all this kind of the change of name and logo. To tell us a little bit about that transition period, because I think that's also important.
The reason that Johan left was simply because he had, if I can call it this way, a promotion to become the Secretary General of the World YMCA. And of course, we at Europe were very happy for him, delighted for him, and he went with our blessing. But it therefore meant that we needed to replace him. So we went through the usual search committee process and interviews and all the usual stuff. But when we were thinking about the next person to take over Johan's role, I think it would be true to say that we recognized we were never going to have another Johan again. And so actually, what is it we're looking for? What we're looking for is, we've had this massive period of change. And I've talked about 18 to 44 countries, and we got through the period. We were getting through the period where there were no new YMCAs to discover. What we needed to focus on is strengthening and empowering those that have been or were being established. So we put a job description together, and we would search for somebody to take on that role. And the person who was successful at the interview was Juan Simones Iglesias, who then was the CEO of YMCA Spain, living in Madrid. So he took on that role to strengthen rather than to develop. I think that was how I would put it together as a description, which was a good thing to do because it allowed Johan to go off and do his new role, and then Juan could establish himself in this slightly different role of strengthening. Yeah, and that's how it planned out, and he's there today. And I think he will tell you exactly. But I worked with him for 1 or 2 years, I think, before I finished. Let me think. I finished in 2012, and I think, yeah, it would have been a year and a half.
Yeah, it wasn't a great amount of time, but it was again important that there was an overlap, I think, as well. That he comes in and there's a little bit of kind of how we've done things and how we're going to do things. I think that's always appreciated. But
and
of course,
I think it was quite healthy also that I've been there, as I've said before, 8 years as treasurer, then 8 years as president. So I've been there 16 years. And so to have some sort of overlap just to make sure he knows what he's doing and get his feet under the table, so to say. But then for me to leave, I think is also healthy so that you can get a new president in and they can develop, if they want to, new directions without the legacy of these old boys sort of not wanting any change. So I
but
think
of course, you weren't done, Peter. I mean, you were maybe done in a European context, and maybe we just take a minute or two. You've touched on it already, and maybe let the cat out of the bag a little bit too early in this interview for people who don't know you. But you then went on to serve as the president of the World Alliance of YMCAs. Would you want to take a few minutes we don't have another hour and a half, or that's for another day. But do you want to just maybe talk a little bit about that and any wonderful memories or any wonderful things that you were involved in at that level, and also bringing so much to the table and so much, as you just said, so much experience, but also knowledge, but also how to do things. Please share with us a little bit.
I finished the presidency in 2012. Then in 2013, there was another Prague Festival, and which was one of the memories of that is the storms, and it was awful weather. But that's another story.
That's another podcast. Yes.
I was approached there by a well-known European national CEO to say they were interested in putting my name forward for the presidency of the World YMCA in the following year, 2014. And absolutely not. I'm not interested in the slightest. I've done it for so many years. I've been there, got all the T-shirts, got the mugs. And anyway, it obviously lit a bit of a burning ember inside me somehow or other because I thought about it. After a while, I thought, okay, and I talked to some key people. If I were to stand, what do you think? Should I be doing so? And if I did, would you support me? I had to have the backing, obviously, of my national movement. Anyway, I put my name forward for World Presidency 2014, and there were two candidates, and I was elected. It was in America at a beautiful YMCA camp in the Rockies in America, and the world opened to me, and it was like everything. 90% of it was absolutely brilliant. 10% of it was challenging. But we haven't talked about my background much. My parents were refugees from Germany just before the Second World War. And I lived over a shop where my dad and my mum ran this shop in a little town in England. And here am I, the son of a refugee, becoming the world president of the biggest and oldest youth organization. That's the YMCA, that's the YMCA. And so working alongside Johan, it was youth empowerment, it was identity, it was strategic direction, it was getting people aligned so that we could work better together. And it was a brilliant experience. And we traveled around the world, and I was able to see other YMCAs and see how the same they were, as well as being how different they were, because they were YMCAs. There's a little photograph of me standing at Buckingham Palace because through the YMCA, the Queen awarded me a medal, and I have I'm an officer of the most excellent order of the British Empire for what that's worth. But which is great, but it's the YMCA. The YMCA has been recognised for the work that we do for young people. And for me to have been the world president is the stunningly ultimate honor. And I just hope that when the history books are written, that we'll look back and say, actually, I did some, alongside other people, did some decent things. And I think we have, because now with Carlos there and with Vision 2030, all of these are footprints working along the pathway to getting some identity and some commonality across us. So hopefully I've been a small piece of that jigsaw.
Well, you've been a force, Peter, and I'll say it if you're being a little bit humble. And I think to get an OBE, as you just pointed to on the wall, shows that you're stretching your reach and how people see you and how people admire you and appreciate you. I think that doesn't just happen by accident. So congratulations to you. But let's just we're just winding down now. Those of you who've maybe got to the end of your teacup like I have, are wondering how long we're going to be. Well, we've just got a few more questions and a little bit more just to share. But let's start to wind down, Peter. And you are an important YMCA person, and you've shared a little bit. But I liked earlier when you were talking about the Darth Vader coming across and speaking to you and encouraging you, and other people who you kind of were generous not to say their names and put them on the spotlight. But there were some significant people in your journey over the years at all different points or stages. Is there anybody you want to kind of mention in terms of who encouraged you? Because I think that's what really people can identify with in the YMCA. Everybody has somebody who came along and said, "Hey, why are you not involved? Do you want to get involved?" So who are those individuals for you? As of course, Dolph, as you mentioned.
One key person in that story would be Terry Ratcliffe, who was he the first president of the European Alliance YMCAs? I think he was. There was, if I understand it correctly, there might have been somebody temporarily there just to get it rolling. But he became the president of the World YMCA, and he was an English guy and came from the north of England and had an interesting English sense of humour, which I thought was fantastic. He used to come to all these meetings all these years. He used to be a massive runner and used to go running with him and stuff. But he just showed me how he could be the humble guy that you've mentioned. Thank you for the plaudits that you've thrown at me. That he grew the YMCA within the remits that he was president, and he set good standards. He was approachable. His governance was good, and he kept us along the straight and narrow so that we did what we should do and didn't do what we shouldn't do. I think the big influence, in addition to that, is he did his time as president, but then he didn't go away. He did stuff that he was good at. So he stayed on at the World YMCA because he was an architect and he helped them with all their building work, which was fantastic. But he took on, as a prime example, the YMCA to help the YMCA in Russia. And he was the field group leader. And when we had this money from America, $1 million to go and develop 5 YMCAs, one of them was Russia. And typical business thinking, you set up a business plan, and here's the money, and there's 3 to 5 years, there's going to be a YMCA, and there's going to be fundraising coming in, there's going to be programs, there's going to be all sorts of stuff. And he stuck with it for, I think, 25 years, because he realized that it just wasn't that simple in places where the culture is totally different to people that write the business plan in the first place. And he just quietly got on with it and made sure that the work that he did was the right work and was influential. And I just learned from him. And regrettably, I went to his funeral last year. So he's one of our angels.
And Peter, obviously such a career, if you will, even if it's a voluntary career, a career in the YMCA, which is unmatched. Is there anybody that has played a significant role in kind of the getting YMCA Europe to those different stages, or leveling up YMCA Europe from your time involved, that we should just maybe mention or even say their name out loud, just in terms of history and heritage. And if people are kind of wondering, it's easy to point out sometimes the leaders of the presidents, but as you said, there's so many people pulling, so many people pushing to trying to get to the next level or the next phase. So from your time involved, anybody who significantly contributed to the history of particularly YMCA Europe?
The first person that comes into my mind is my wife.
Wow.
Quite genuinely, I started in 1981 with YMCA, and our first daughter was born in 1981. So my family, over the past 2 years, have known nothing but me going to, I've got another committee meeting, and I'm sorry I'm not going to be here tonight. And I'm just flying off to Prague for a couple of days or whatever. And without that support, and there's so many of us that are in that situation, without that support, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. I just wouldn't be. And just occasionally, she said to me, Pete, you're doing too much, don't burn out. And that's happened to me a couple of times. So I've got to say that, and I mean it most sincerely. If
that's
it were
beautiful to hear.
Support, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I've talked about Terry. There's the story about Egon Slopianka that you perhaps pick up another time, but he was the first secretary of European Alliance YMCAs who got to know the YMCA when he was a prisoner of war, and he committed himself to that. Those are the sort of people that what's that phrase of how we stand on the shoulders of giants. I mean, there are so many that I'm not sure that I want to choose any person in particular. Just so many, and that's the whole point. Not only are we a federation of individual YMCAs, but we're this 65 million people around the world, and everybody's important. I've been in tears with the most apparently insignificant person that isn't a national leader or isn't whatever, but is a mover and shaker who's a simple member at a local YMCA somewhere that teaches you something, and then we go into as the YMCA people, and I've met heads of churches, I've met prime ministers, I've met government ministers, and we influence them. So it's us as a team. I sincerely think it's us as a team that does it.
And I love that, Peter. Thank you. It is us as a team. And I think that team spans right the way back to 1844. And it's just, just passing that baton on to the next team to run forward with it. And I think that's what is significant throughout history. It's not our climbing walls or pools, it's our people. Peter, I'm going to ask you to finish with a story or special memory that you don't mind sharing from anywhere in your journey. And I think that would just be an appropriate way. It could have been, dinner with the Pope, or ice cream down at the shack in Thessaloniki. It doesn't really matter. But do you have a story or a special memory that you wouldn't mind sharing with us today?
A European one?
That would be appropriate. Yeah.
Visiting the European Scouts in Germany, where I was with Juan, so in his early days of the YMCA, where we were going down the river bank and watching the river go by and seeing the Lorelei, which look up another time to see what I'm talking about. But just sleeping in a camp with YMCA, European YMCA people, just ordinary people around campfires, having the best time ever, costing nothing other than being part of the YMCA movement and loving being there, and in a small, modest sort of way, because the president was there, responding to their passion. And that's just one example. There's 1,000 of those.
Of course.
But yes, all these posh people that I've met and these important people I've met, but actually, who gets the work done? It's the people back at the YMCA's who actually open the doors and clean the floors and stuff. They're the important ones. Yeah.
Peter, thank you for sharing that. That's a really nice kind of final little a little story for us. And for if you're still with us, we thank you. We're there now. It's okay. A lot of the things that we've covered today in terms of different topics, you can find on the link in the description, also part of the YMCA's heritage kind of websites or pages. And we encourage you, if you've not checked out other people's interviews, just like Peter here, there's so much rich content and stories and memories. So I'd encourage you to have a look along the other playlists and grab yourself another cup of tea. You're allowed, and enjoy those. Peter, thank you so much for having an hour with us today and sharing with us a little bit of your journey. I'm sure we could have done a 16-hour marathon, but maybe there's a space for another conversation another day. Thank you very much, and let me, on behalf of the YMCA movement, thank you for your leadership and your contributions. So any final words? And we are done here, I think.
Thank you for interviewing me. As self-conscious as I am, isn't it great that we're putting some heritage tracks down? And there's a lot going on that we just forget. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for inviting me to take part.
Thank you. And from me and Peter, thank you all, and have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world or whenever you are watching this. And see you in the next one.